All right, so this is a long time in coming. I really wanted to do this sooner than later. Shout out to Tommy Temper, first of all. I have been trying to get a judge to come and speak with us concerning scoring fights, but so far I've been somewhat fruitless in making that happen, but I am still trying in the background. However, I decided to look online at certain judges who judge fights and their comments on judging fights. And I found 3 articles. This first one is from The Guardian. And the judge that we're looking at is Carla Caputo. Now, I'm not going to read the entire article. If you want, you can freeze the screen and you can actually read the article for yourself. But I'm going to summarize each of the articles, okay? So this one, which she wrote, initially it was written in the Queensberry Rules, and now it's published in The Guardian, which is a newspaper. The sport section of the Guardian is titled, What I've Learned from Scoring 528 Fights as a Boxing Judge. So Carla Caputo, she just goes into a very brief history of how she became a judge. About 7 years ago, she got herself involved in boxing, really loved it, really got plugged into it. And because of that, she was invited to judge an amateur fight. And she ended up getting into judging. Now, she had no background in boxing in terms of none of her family boxed. So the boxing community looked at her kind of strange. And she didn't really know. She had scored fights, by watching it on television or live. But she had never really judged a match or scored rounds of a fight as an actual judge. And she found out that you need to be seated in the judge's chair to score a fight. And her article is very interesting because she talks about the fact that where you're actually positioned in a fight matters. If you're just watching a fight on television versus you're watching a fight, say, for example, in an arena or in a bar or in a club, how close you are to the ring makes a difference. Whether you're in press row or whether you're an actual judge seated ringside, very close to the action. The only person who's closer to the action than you are the actual fighters and the referee. And she says, when scoring a fight, a judge must consider 3 things. 1, the number of quality blows on the targeted area. And what do you mean by targeted area? The areas which a boxer has to hit, okay? Because not every part of your body, first of all, you're allowed to hit, and secondly, is a scoring area. And then 2, domination of the round by technical or tactical superiority, and 3, competitiveness. She may be speaking about the amateur boxing, but nonetheless. She talks about the obvious things that are not factors in scoring fights. A lot of people think that the boxer being a champion or having a championship belt makes a difference, but she's very clear on that, saying that if you are a belt holder, that is not a factor in scoring rounds of a fight. And there are a number of things that judges can see that other people cannot see, and I think this is the most important thing. The first thing the judges can see is the force of a punch. And I'm literally going to quote her here. Sometimes a punch lands much harder than what is seen by those sitting ringside or at home. Conversely, sometimes a punch doesn't land with the intensity that is perceived by those who are not judging the fight. Sometimes the punch just rolls off the opponent's arm or shoulder. So some punches make a lot of noise because either the punching gloves hit another punching glove, for example, or sometimes it makes tremendous noise because it hit a very hard part of your body, like your shoulder or your elbow, and it makes this explosive sound. But in fact, it's because a hard surface hit a hard surface. And remember, the judges can hear the grunts of fighters when they get hit with something that really hurt them. They can see their body language much better than somebody who's further away. They can hear them breathing and see if there's a disruption in their breathing pattern. So there's all these fine details. The closer you are to the action, the more you can pick up more from the action. You can also see how punishing certain punches are and how devastating the damage really is up close. So I do believe that the judges do get a much better view of things, especially, the punches that are like infighting punches that sometimes are sneaky little punches, sneaky little shots to the body, and they can see the body language, the reaction of fighters up close. So I do agree with her on that. She goes on to say, if a punch even landed. So she's talking now, a lot of times, crowds might say ooh and ah, but in fact, the punch actually missed. It went, 2 inches away from the opponent, actually hit their shoulder or arm or hit their glove, or, bounced off their shoulder, but it looked like it landed. It looked like the shot hit them on the chin, but in fact, the person rolled it and actually parried it with their glove. So she talks about that. And she also talks about if the punch even landed in the scoring zone. So, okay, the punch did land, but it didn't land on a part of the person's body that they're vulnerable to, And another thing I would like to introduce that has not been stated here, I'm not a judge, and probably I shouldn't have my input, but I'm going to add it in. Sometimes, the guy's a guy, what everybody thinks is flush, but the guy rode the punch. He went with the punch. And when you ride punches, it takes a whole lot of sting off the punch. It looks like if the person's head is just snapped back, but in fact, the person actually rode a punch with equal speed and quickness to take the sting off the punch. So sometimes a punch that looks very dramatic, but then you say, man, that guy has a hell of a chin, actually wasn't as dramatic as you think. The person actually took a lot of sting off the punch, a lot of power off the punch, and so they have not been badly damaged by the punch. And then she did a test. She allowed her fiance, Matt, to do this little experiment with her where Matt would judge rounds of the fight up close in the judge's chair, 2 rows back in the first and second row, and then 8 rows back, and then from television. And this is what she found out. Of the fights scored at the judge's table, all his cards matched the official results. From the first or second row, 8 out of his 10 scores match the official results. From more than 10 rows back, only 7 of his cards match. Interesting, isn't it? So the further away you go is actually the more distorted your view of the fight. He said when he scored it on television, however, 8 out of the 10 cards that he scored matched the official results. So it seems as though if you see a fight on television or on video, it still doesn't give you as accurate a judgment of the fight as if you were actually on the apron of the fight, at the ring of the fight, up close and personal. So she goes on to talk about why it's important for people to understand what judges are saying. Why the judge's perspective of a fight, though it may seem controversial at times, especially with close fights, is probably better than the judgment that you may have from further away from the fight. I want to go to Steve Weisfield, who is a very experienced judge. He has actually judged 1,600 fights so far. He started judging in 1991. He's also been in 80 World Championship fights. And he spent 2 years as the unofficial scorer for HBO's Boxing After Dark. Steve Weisfield gives us even a better perspective on judging when he starts to speak now about another aspect of judging, which is of the 4 criteria that are used to judge a fight, or shall I say, to judge the rounds of a fight, which is very important. He says, of the 4 criteria, which is clean punches, effective aggressiveness, defense, and ring generalship, he says clean, effective punches are by far the most important one. That's the focus that they really stay on. He says everything centers around that. And he goes on to talk a little bit more about clean punches. I just want to quote him for a minute. To me, clean punches are the most important aspect. The other factors are really tied to that. Take the phrase, effective aggressiveness. How is a boxer effective? He's effective by landing clean punches. How about defense? A boxer shows great defense by not getting hit with clean punches. And finally, the term ring generalship. A boxer uses the ring to put himself in a position to land clean punches. So let's focus on the phrase clean punches. It may not be initially apparent, but there are various elements included within that phrase. First, there's a number of punches. A boxer who lands more punches generally wins. However, harder punches count more than lighter ones. However, there's no mathematical formula that equates the number of punches with the hardness of a punch. A judge has to weigh that also based on experience. For example, a seemingly lighter punch can cause a boxer to stagger and will be scored higher than a seemingly harder punch that has no effect on the boxer. So that's why we talk about effectiveness. So clean, effective punching. So sometimes, even a boxer will tell you this. He tapped the guy on the top of his head, and the guy staggers all around, or he gets dropped by getting hit on the top of his head. Whereas he was punching him on his chin with what he thinks is much harder punches, and the guy wasn't going anywhere. Mike Tyson talked about that. So it's really the effectiveness of the punches, I would say, to clarify what Steve Weisfield is saying. So he goes on to talk about defense, and let me just summarize that. Basically, defense, he's saying here, is something that is scored, but let's say, for example, you have 2 fighters, right? And one fighter's really being aggressive, and he's throwing a lot of punches, but the other guy's dodging and slipping his punches, but he's not throwing any punches and landing. Nobody's scoring. The judges are going to call it an even round. They're not going to penalize the guy who's being aggressive, mainly because they don't want to discourage the guy who's trying to land punches from landing. So they usually score that round an even round. At least that's how he puts it. So remember, the idea behind boxing is, and the idea behind defense is, that you want to not get hit, but at the same time, the sweet science of boxing is to hit also. The whole idea behind not getting hit is so that you can hit your opponent. If you're not hitting your opponent, then you're not scoring. And if you're not scoring, what's the point? So we go to effective aggression. Let's say, for example, there's a scenario where both guys have similar activity, are landing probably the same amount of punches. Let's say they're going to favor the guy who's the aggressor. So the guy, whoever is the aggressor in that, even though it's more or less an even round, they'll still give the round to the aggressive guy, the guy who's making the fight, the guy who's trying to make the thing happen. Now, if both guys are aggressive and they're just fighting in the center of the ring in a caboose, it could be like a stalemate. It could be like a swing round. Ring generalship. Well, that's just the guy who controls the fight. He controls where the fight is happening, right? And that's what basically Steve Weisfield he says. And he talks about the 10-point must system of scoring, which is very interesting because, as you know, the person who wins the round, there's no penalization, or nobody gets knocked down, or nobody's completely dominated, like beaten up really bad in the round. It's usually the winner of the round gets 10 points and the loser gets 9 points, right? So that's just the way how that goes. This judge, he comes from North Carolina. His name is Barry Lindenman, and of recent times he scored the Jean Pascal versus Badou Jack fight. Okay. First of all, he makes it very clear that as a judge, they don't score fights; they score individual rounds. Why that's important is because professional judges, after they score the round of the fight, they submit their scorecard for the round of the fight to the referee, who gives it to a supervisor. And the supervisor is the one that actually tallies the rounds of the fight. Now, yes, the judge also keeps a copy of his tally. He has something to tally, so he can tally and see how the fight is going along. But it's important to understand they have to submit, after every round, their scorecard. So round by round, they're submitting their scorecards. So it's kind of like you can't go back in time and change their scorecard for some round or the other. You understand? There's a difference between a close round and a close fight. And this judge is able to give us that difference. So, for example, you can have a fight where, if you look above at the top here, you have fighter A and fighter B. Fighter A, as you can see here, won every single round of the fight. Seems as though he had a dominant performance, right? He won every single round of the fight, 120 to 108 on some judges' scorecard. However, as this judge is saying, the rounds could have been very close rounds in which fighter A just did enough to beat fighter B. And so every single round that was a close round, the judge gave it to fighter A. Fighter A didn't really dominate fighter B. Fighter A did just enough in every single round to beat fighter B. Now, the fight itself was not a close fight. But every single round of that fight had close rounds. Now, here's the difference. You can have a close fight where the rounds weren't close. Take, for example, if you scroll right down and you look at another example down below, you see fighter A and fighter B. Fighter A knocks down fighter B in round 1. Fighter B comes back and knocks down fighter A in round 2. Fighter A knocks down fighter B in round 3. And it's swinging back and forth. Okay? However, fighter A wins 7 rounds and fighter B wins 5 rounds. It's swinging back and forth, back and forth. Okay? Now, none of those rounds are close rounds, right? None of those rounds are close rounds. However, the fight ends up being a close fight, where fighter A wins 7 rounds and fighter B wins 5 rounds. That's a close fight. Why is this important? Because we always talk about swing rounds. And we just went through extremes here, extreme situations. But if you can score a round for one fighter and you can make a case to score a round for another fighter, this is where judges sometimes have scorecards that make people feel, oh my God, that judge has a scorecard that's way out there, but not really. Because the other thing you do after scoring a round is you tabulate, you write down a commentary on the round. So you have a reason why you scored the round the way you did. And once you have a good reason, remember that scoring is something that's subjective but yet objective. And you've given the reasoning for why you scored it, understanding that you're a judge and also you're right there, right up on the action. It's not unreasonable for sometimes your scorecard to seem like an outlier, especially with 3 judges. Sometimes you have an outlier with 1 judge. It happens. Is there corruption in boxing? Absolutely. But I'm just showing you why sometimes the audience doesn't agree with what the judges have said. Here's another point that he made. And this one's fantastic. He talks about how, for example, in this example here that you see below, the table that is, fighter A has won 7 rounds. Fighter B wins 5 rounds. But fighter B wins 5 of the last rounds. It's coming on strong in the second half of the fight, and he wins 5 of the rounds. The fans remember the last thing that fighter B was doing, so they think that the fight has gone to fighter B, forgetting that the earlier rounds by fighter A were put in the bag. Now, this is an extreme situation where fighter A knocked down fighter B 7 times, and then fighter B comes back and knocks down fighter A 5 times. And probably on the verge of stopping fighter A, right? And so the fans are like, man, you should give this fight to fighter B. But it doesn't work like that. Even though fighter B probably was on the verge of knocking out fighter A, you have 12 rounds to do it in. If you don't get it done in 12 rounds, it doesn't matter. Still got to get the fight to fighter A. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like, share, comment, subscribe, donate if you wish. How much you need. Peace.